A very warm welcome to all our participants and all of our viewers, all of our speakers in this, the Universal Peace Federation of Oceania webinar on the theme towards peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula, a new approach. My name is Greg Stone and I'm the Secretary General of UPF Oceania, and it's my privilege to be the moderator for this webinar today. We have a particularly fine panel of speakers to address this important topic. They are Madam Andiquela Mara Nelatikau, the former First Lady of the Republic of Fiji, diplomat, Member of Parliament, Member of Cabinet. Also, we have Dr. Adrian Buzo, former Australian diplomat, who was in the embassies, the Australian embassies in both North and South Korea. And he's now a writer and an academic. Also, Dr. Thomas J. Ward, President of the Unification Theological Seminary. Reverend Jenny Chalmers, Vicar of St Andrew's Church in Taupo in New Zealand. And Dr. Thomas G. Walsh, Chairman of UPF International. I will introduce each of them in more detail as I invite them up to speak. And as our first speaker, however, it is my very great pleasure to invite our host for this webinar, Mr. Yutaka Yamada, who is the Chairman of the Universal Peace Federation in Oceania. Mr. Yutaka Yamada graduated from Sun Moon University with a Master's of Theology in 2014. He worked as a leader of youth and college students in Korea from 2004 to 2008. He is the regional chair of UPF in the Philippines from 2008 to 2013 and the national director of UPF in Malaysia from 2013 to 2019. He's currently chairman of the Universal Peace Federation in Oceania. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Yutaka Yamada.
Thank you, our Reverend Stone. It is my great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Thomas Walsh, Chairman of UPF International, to all our distinguished panelists, speakers, and viewers from around the world for our UPF webinar on the theme, Towards Peaceful Unification of the Korean Peninsula, a New Approach. The founder of the Universal Peace Federation, Father Sam Myung and Mother Hak Cha Han are, in the final analysis, religious leaders. However, because of their passionate quest for world peace, which they see as the will of God, their work has not been limited to the field of religion. They have founded and activated as astoundingly diverse array of organizations in areas such as the media, humanitarian relief, interfaith, academia, international relations, business, and the arts, to mention a few. They see all these efforts as necessary to contribute to bringing the world together as one human family under God. It is no surprise, therefore, to observe that their lifelong work to bring about the peaceful reunification of their fatherland, the Korean Peninsula, has a distinctive spiritual element. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., to get rid of an enemy, we must first get rid of enmity. This phrase captures the essence of the remarkable meeting that took place between Father Moon and Mother Moon and Mikhail Gorbachev and Kim Il-sung in 1990 and 1991, respectively. At that time, Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union, and Kim Il-sung was the supreme leader of North Korea. Somehow, a rapport and trust was established between what could only be described at the time as arch enemies. The friendship that was established in those meetings lasted for decades and even became intergenerational in the case of the son and grandson of Kim Il-sung, all of whom honored and respected Father and Mother Moon. This is why the webinar theme today includes the words, a new approach. It is also why we have the unusual combination of the more programmatic political analysis and religious leaders as a speaker today. We want to more clearly understand this new approach, this loving and winning your enemy approach, and see if it indeed opens up a new and more promising avenue for achieving the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and in fact may even have ramifications for achieving peace more broadly in the world, where many conflicts are taking place between bitter enemies. So this is not just your average, ordinary webinar. It is an exploration of how we can work more effectively for the cherished and long hoped for peace in our world. Once again, I thank you for your attendance, and on behalf of UPF Oceania, I wish you a fruitful, productive, and enjoyable webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yutaki Yamada, for those very insightful and stimulating opening remarks. The issue of the divided Korean Peninsula is said to be one of the most critical and important unresolved questions of the global order today. And as mentioned by Mr. Yamada in his opening remarks, this webinar has an unusual combination of speakers coming from different perspectives, not only different countries, but also different perspectives, from the pragmatic geopolitical perspective, from the diplomacy area, from the religious area. So this is one of the hallmarks of UPF, is that it brings together, very different aspects. But I think it's all needed if we're to address the issue of the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula effectively. So it's indeed an unusual combination of speakers, and maybe you've never seen such a combination of speakers anywhere else in the world. So perhaps this is a first. In any case, we're certainly in for a very interesting webinar ahead. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Following their presentations, there will be a time for question and answer to the panelists. And viewers, please send in your questions via the chat. Our first panelist and speaker today is Madam Andikwela Mara Nalatikau. She is from the beautiful island nation of Fiji, located in the Pacific Ocean. Madam Andikwela is a lawyer by profession. However, she served her country, Fiji, in many capacities, including as a diplomat and as a politician. She served as a cabinet minister in the Fiji Parliament. And she was also the First Lady of Fiji from 2009 to 2015 as the wife of Ratu Apeli Nalatikau, the President of Fiji. Madam Andikwela and Ratu Apeli have two children, a son and a daughter. So please join me in warmly welcoming Madam Andikwela.
Bulavinaka, Madam Moon and the Moon family, Dr. Thomas Walsh, Mr. Greg Stone, Mr. Omada, fellow speakers, Universal Peace Federation members, family and friends. On preparing for today's webinar, I was posed with the question, if we cannot clearly proclaim victory and if we are unwilling to accept defeat, how and when does a war or conflict end? This is a question that has been put to me many times over. In my small island nation of Fiji, this question has been brought up many times. How does conflict truly end? Having lived through 4 coups, 3 military and 1 civilian, I do know that it does not end or end well by force. When we force a conflict to end with arms, human loss and devastation without properly taking into account the needs and wants of all the people on both sides, we lay an unsteady and weak foundation for the future. We must look at all angles of the situation, and the events of the years before that began the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. The problem's roots were growing long before that, and that it is important knowledge to be taken into consideration. In wars and conflicts, it is said that brute force and armed weapons is the only power and way forward. Therefore, in order to gain the opposite of conflict and war, that is a true peace and a prosperous nation, we must understand that it also takes the opposite of that type of power. And in that instant, it is not guns or armies that will bring true peace. It is knowledge, understanding, and love that is the power moving forward. Knowledge of the conflict in its entirety, understanding of both sides and what they really want, and the love of humanity, a people, a nation, and its history of being one Korea. This may seem difficult considering where both sides are at a standoff, a long-standing armistice. However, to quote the late Reverend Myung, I quote, "Remember that the Unification Church rose not in freedom, but from a prison, the pit of suffering." If we can fathom that and understand that, much can be achieved even from the darkest of places, and not lose hope. We can bring about true change and the lasting, transitional, and true peace. It is often asked, should religious organizations be involved in politics and political conflicts at that? Absolutely, because at the very crux of it all our religions desire the end goal of peace and the preservation of the greatest gift to us by God, and that is the gift of human life. Where states value economic gain and gain of territory and power, it is through religion and the understanding and desire for peace as the absence of war where we will all succeed. Knowledge and understanding will allow us to penetrate where armed weapons cannot. And there is no better way than through soft diplomacy tactics. In 2013, Pope Francis spoke of the victims of historical divisions and concluded that, quote, "It is difficult for them to accept our invitation to forgiveness and reconciliation, since they think we are ignoring their pain and asking them to give up their memory and ideals. But if they see the witness of authentically fraternal and reconciled communities, they will find that witness luminous and attractive." We cannot force either side to see and appreciate the beauty of unification, but we can show them, and this was wonderfully done by Reverend and Madam Moon, by introducing a united church and family, and with their drive to reunification beginning over 30 years ago, they planted a seed of hope that has fostered engagement with the North that many others were incapable of doing. Reverend and Madam Moon have understood that at the heart of Korea, a once unified Korea, there is a spiritual heritage as well as a common culture, tradition, language, and one people. Reverend and Madam Moon's creation of peace zones with opportunities they created in the sporting, cultural, humanitarian, educational, and political sectors. They formed a depth of engagement and mutual trust that will be the foundation for change and unification in the years to come. We must also take note that when barriers come down and there is peace and unity, there is also a void of a life that once was. It is therefore crucial that this void be filled with a unified Korea, founded in a source of freedom, rights, and values for all its citizens to ensure a lasting peace and true movement forward. We as an international family must always support and guide the Peninsula to unite. Whereas in the past, the international influence was part of the cause of division. For the present and future, we must now stand united as a cause of unification. And we must always keep faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. However, in this case, we have seen a unified Korea before. We have seen wars end. We have seen countries return to a peace they once knew, and families and people reunited. And I truly believe this can happen again. If there's one thing we have learned from this post-COVID world, it is that the unthinkable can happen. States agreed to shut down in days, bringing the world to a standstill for a greater good. And with that, a new global precedent has been set. New opportunities unfold for all nations. And I believe that together, one of those opportunities we will see to fruition will be a united, independent, and free Korea. Kamsahamnida, pinakamakalevu. Thank you.
What can I say? Wow, that was an amazing speech. We've got to get a copy of that. That was really something. Thank you so much, Madam Administrator, for that beautiful, beautiful speech and for highlighting the great importance of things like knowledge, understanding, and love in order to overcome the war and the conflict in all areas. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is via video, Dr. Adrian Bouzeau. He is a former Australian diplomat to both North and South Korea. Back in the 1970s, Australia opened up an embassy in North Korea, and he was one of the diplomats who was stationed there, and later serving also in the Australian embassy in South Korea. He's also served on a number of Australian government bodies, including the Australian Korea Foundation, 1990 to 2000, and he's published widely in the field of Korean language and also Korean studies. He's been a writer and a commentator and a consultant on North Korean affairs for over 20 years. The third edition of his book, entitled The Making of Modern Korea, was published by Routledge in 2016, and Routledge also published the second edition of his book, Politics and Leadership in North Korea, The Guerrilla Dynasty, published in 2017. So we are very privileged indeed to have Dr. Buzzo present at our webinar today. And because of his other commitments this weekend, he will present via a pre-recorded video. So let us warmly welcome Dr. Buzzo as our second panelist today.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation. My task here is to talk briefly about some current developments, potential developments in engage with North Korea. And in doing so, I'm going to do this through the lens of three fairly significant, perhaps I should say potentially significant events over the past 12 months and examine how they might impact on diplomacy with the North. Now, these are events that were of significant importance for government in the United States, in South Korea, and in North Korea. They consist of the following. Of course, the United States has been the election of Joe Biden as president. In South Korea, there was a legislative election last April, and the Progressive Party of President Moon Jae-in took a landslide victory, and that obviously has possible ramifications for dealing with the North. And then in the North itself, the unchanging North, it conducted its 8th party Congress. This is only the 8th time that the party has had a Congress since 1945. But I suppose better tip my hand a little bit by saying that not a great deal came out of it. But nevertheless, the Congress is perhaps the premier political event that routinely occurs in the North. So, what are the ramifications of these three developments? Well, firstly, so far, of course, Joe Biden has only been in office for roughly 6 weeks. So it would be expecting a little bit much if we had a clear idea of his directions, even in the region, let alone the North. He gave his first major foreign relations speech not long ago, and there was no mention of North Korea. Not all his key players are in place at the moment, and we have to understand that he has some pretty big issues to deal with that far outstrip the admittedly major impact of the North on international diplomacy. But you know, when you put that alongside COVID diplomacy, climate change diplomacy, the general unwinding of the Trump era directions, then you add the Middle East and sundry little crises such as currently occurring in Myanmar. I think that's understandable. But casting the net a bit wider, Biden is an experienced foreign affairs operator, and he is heir to the policy of what was called by the Obama administration of strategic patience, but by Obama's opponents as a do-nothing policy. And so basically, when we look at what has occurred in the United States in recent months, there is little prospect of a significant policy orientation on North Korea developing. Moving on to the South, now the election victory of the progressives in April 2020 was quite a surprise, and it more or less confirmed at the moment what is called the eclipse for now of the right wing or conservative side of South Korean politics. This is largely due to the poor performance of the last two presidents from this side of politics, Myung, and of course it's particularly due to the performance of Park Geun-hye, who was impeached while in office in 2017. It's probably inevitable, swings and rounds. The Conservatives will make a comeback, but at this stage, it would appear that the Progressives have a strong handle on the direction of policy making towards North Korea for the foreseeable future. This may seem positive, but of course, for the most part, it has not been Seoul that has dictated the timing and the direction of talks with the North. It's long been a truism that Pyongyang makes sure that it has full control over timing and substance of talks. And we do need to remember that South Korea and North Korea have already been talking officially for 50 years on and off, and that is a certain point towards the most unlikely scenario of renewed substantive talks between the two parties. Moon Jae-in has only 15 months left in office. He can't succeed himself, and so he is essentially a lame duck. And he may wish to make gestures towards the North, but the North, of course, those masters of realpolitik know fully well that he is powerless to introduce or to do anything that might help the North along its own chosen path. So that takes us to the North. Now, the North conducted its 8th Korean Workers' Party Congress in January. Most previous congresses have been essentially celebration affairs. Everything worked out beforehand, and more or less they confirm rather than debate issues, of course. This one was a little bit different, much more of a crisis Congress. It came only 6 months after a very rare admission by Kim Jong-un, the leader, that the government's economic planning was failing. Now, he could hardly say otherwise, I suppose, but most of the time in the North, the leaders say nothing at all. They certainly never say anything negative at all. But in this case, you just have to tote it up. There have been the natural disasters of significant flooding. There's the COVID crisis. We just don't know what's happening in North Korea, but they have a very, very poor internal health system. And they have chosen just simply to close the borders tightly, the only significant border really being with China. And of course, that has seen plummeting trade with China, which is its major market. And then, of course, you have to add that the ongoing, this is probably the biggest issue, the ongoing very strong sanctions that were implemented by the United Nations against North Korea after their series of nuclear tests in 2016-17. There was no sense of economic reform, let alone changes to the political system, let alone new blood in the party came through the Congress. So the only thing that is very clear in the North is the age-old thing, which is the nuclear program goes on. This is not as crazy as it might sound. First of all, this is a government which, a bit like the government in Myanmar, as we see, feels virtually no responsibility for the welfare of its people. its function as it sees it is the survival of the Pyongyang elite. The other thing, of course, is the fact that the ongoing sophistication of its nuclear weapons program produces, basically, puts time on its side. There's virtually no limit to what the North Koreans can achieve in the area of North Korean weaponry or nuclear weaponry, and that will go on and go on and go on until there is some fundamental change of heart, change of direction, what I like to call even just a loss of nerve in the North. So that leaves us with three events where I leave you to draw your own conclusions from my presentation of them. But really, that just leaves me to make some very brief comments, which I apologize if they seem to be on the edge of my experience in this, because I myself do not actively deal with the North Koreans and have not for many years. But if one is looking for looking from a perspective of what can be done and perhaps what should be done in engaging the North, then we find perhaps the first thing, if I may refer briefly here, the first thing to note here, of course, is that all that is available to the peacemakers, so to speak, are baby steps. We are looking at a ruthless, remorseless regime that just has had no compunction in the past of behaving in what can only be described, and which has been described by the International Court of Justice as an inhumane fashion. So the first thing, of course, is that all people of goodwill should support governments and organizations with viable peace agendas. Pursuing second-line private contacts where these serve such agendas is important. But of course, we do need to bear in mind that we are, as I said, when we do deal with North Koreans, we are dealing with people of a singularly ruthless brand. That should not stop us from trying to appeal to their better angels wherever, whenever we can. Of course, though, at the same time, it is incumbent upon us for us not to be jerked off base, separated out from our core values, which, of course, begin with with calling the North Koreans to account for their appalling human rights record. So there we have it. Nothing that is, I'm sure you are no strangers to these to such thoughts. But meanwhile, just simply to sum up what I've had to say today, it has really been events are moving, but they are moving outside North Korea, and they are certainly moving outside the very narrow isolationist orbit of the Pyongyang elite and the Korean Workers' Party. And there seems, as we look at the evidence today, little prospect of development in the near future. So thank you very much for this invitation, and I wish you well in your deliberations.
Well, thank you. That was great to have Dr. Adrian Buzzo present to us the more, pragmatic, sort of practical aspect of the difficulty of the mission that we face to bring peaceful unification to the Korean Peninsula. We thank him very much for viewing that in the light of the three recent developments over the last 12 months, the new elections of Joe Biden in the United States, elections in South Korea, and also the current the eighth Party Congress that took place in North Korea. So very much we thank Dr. Buzo for his presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Thomas J. Ward. Dr. Ward currently serves as the president of the Unification Theological Seminary in New York and professor of Peace and Development Studies there. Prior to this current role, he served for 18 years as Dean of the University of Bridgeport's College of Public and International Affairs, where he taught graduate courses on culture, development, peace and conflict studies, and political and economic integration. He's been a Fulbright Scholar, a Taiwan Foreign Ministry Research Fellow, and a guest lecturer at the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing and at the Academy Sinika's Institute of Modern History in Taipei. Dr. Ward has lived and worked not only in the United States, but also in Europe, in Latin America, and in East Asia. And he speaks fluently 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. I first met Dr. Ward quite a few years ago when he was a very prominent presenter and co-author, I believe, of the Kausa material, which was taught around the world at that time, comprising a critique and counterproposal to Marxism, Leninism, based on the affirmation of God. So we're extremely happy to have Dr. Ward present to us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Ward. Sorry, Dr. Ward, you need to unmute.
I hope that it was good to unmute. We'll see. Anyway, I'd like to first of all really thank Reverend Stone for his kind introduction and for his and Mr. Yamada's invitation to participate in this particular program and the recommendation from Dr. Walsh that I be a part of today. I feel very honored to be here. I want to thank the 2 previous speakers, Madam Naila Tikau. I thought that was a beautiful presentation, Madam, and you outlined so many key both diplomatic and religious concerns, and you've obviously been through a lot in your country, and you bring a lot of wisdom to this conversation. I thank you for that. And Dr. Buzo, he really laid things out in a very, I think, a very frank and useful way for all of us. I've had the opportunity to visit North Korea twice. It's a very unusual place, that's all I can say. Very nice people, but very unusual circumstances. And I also look forward to hearing Reverend Jeremy Chalmers, who I think is going to give us more of a spiritual insight into this particular conflict. Thank you. You reduced my burden, Reverend Chalmers. I guess I'd like to kind of speak in some sense from a historical perspective, and I hope that what I say will be of use. As Reverend Stone said, really between 1980 and 1992, I was very much involved with a whole series of issues related to the Cold War. And Reverend Moon was very concerned about the Cold War, which might be surprising to think that a religious person would be concerned about something like that. However, I would remind you that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, he stood up and he said, I have to do something at the time of Hitler because a madman has taken over my country. And he acted as a person of conscience. And the same is true for Reverend Moon. His concerns about communism had nothing to do with politics, had nothing to do with private property, had everything to do with the fact that people's fundamental human rights were being violated. There's a book that became very popular in the mid and late 1990s, which was called The Black Book of Communism, written by a group of French academics. The lead author was Stéphane Courtois. And it's an amazing book because it documents very clearly how 100 million people died because of communism. And the most important thing about the book is that it was accepted everywhere. In the United States, CBS, ABC, NBC, BBC, France, Antenne 2, everywhere, it was accepted as a reality. No one challenged it because the work was so meticulously done. So Reverend Moon stood up against that particular problem because an ideology which promised paradise actually resulted in genocide. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the way in which he worked, because it was a carrot and stick approach. And I want to talk first of all about the stick dimension of his approach in dealing with the Soviet Union. And I'd like to mention 4 particular contributions. There are others, but I want to mention these 4 in particular today. One of them was Cows International, which Reverend Stone mentioned, which was a objective presentation of communism. It wasn't about the things that Marx did wrong, about taking books out of the London Library. We weren't interested in any of those things. It was an analysis of the Marxist worldview and a reflection on the limitations of that worldview, if you will. And it was a very systematic, very thoroughly researched document that we were able to share around the world. Secondly, there was an organization called the International Security Council that was related to Cows International. And it was headed by Dr. Joseph Cherba, who had been a member of the National Security Council under President Ronald Reagan. And it was also led by Eugene Rostow, a very prominent security expert under several Democrat presidents. So you had both Republican and Democrat perspectives on this particular issue. And they emphasized a number of issues. And one of the main things that they emphasized was that the Soviet Union was thriving and growing because of irresponsible lending, continuing of lending without any conditions based on their violations of human rights. And likewise, trade, providing strategically important items to the Soviet Union, which were allowing it to remain so prominent. And that the International Security Council played a very important role in getting the word out about those things. And it was not popular for the Soviets, and also showed where they were working and what they were trying to achieve in each part of the world. Thirdly, there was the Washington Times. And the Washington Times made 3 very important contributions. The first of those is it pointed out all of the injustices of what was going on inside of Nicaragua, particularly the things that were going on with some of the Native American populations there, and the things that were particularly the Mosquito Indians, and the ways that they were being essentially terrorized and marginalized because they did not share the Marxist view of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Secondly, the Washington Times was very important in terms of exposing what was going on in Afghanistan with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And most importantly, related to this, in November of 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev was invited to address a joint session of Congress, a privilege which was basically given to very few people, people such as Winston Churchill. It was not, François Mitterrand, it was not something that was normally given to a country which was in a hostile relationship with the United States. It had never happened before. And the Washington Times took a certain posture related to this. The posture the Washington Times took was that this was not acceptable, because by doing this, basically, we were saying it's fine what the Soviets are doing in Afghanistan, where they had no plan to leave and they continued to dominate a country against their will. Effectively, because of the Washington Times, the invite to Mikhail Gorbachev was blocked. And believe it or not, 3 months after that, he changed the policy on Afghanistan and he announced that the Soviets would begin to withdraw from Afghanistan. The third thing was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was referred to as Star Wars. Basically, it was an attempt to deal with the incredible Soviet buildup of nuclear weapons. I believe that at that time, for every 1 nuclear weapon, of course, already the United States had an enormous amount of these, but for every one that the United States had, the Soviet Union had 3. And instead of saying, well, we're going to proliferate and produce more weapons, at that time the idea was, no, let's begin to find a way to make these weapons ineffective through the creation of a defense system. And that defense system was mocked by most media outfits, but it was supported by the Washington Times. And in 1986, at Reykjavik, Mikhail Gorbachev said to Ronald Reagan, I'm only asking you one thing. I'm asking you to stop SDI, stop the Strategic Defense Initiative. And Reagan said, I can't do that. And that talk at Reykjavik, it fell apart. But 2 months later, Mikhail Gorbachev came back and said, it's okay, you can go ahead and do that. And let's just begin to work together. The consequence of that is that the United States was in a much stronger bargaining power position than it ever had been in the past. And for all practical purposes, the Cold War was coming to a close. In conflict resolution, there is a moment referred to as ripeness. And ripeness is the moment when one or both parties in a conflict recognize it's time to begin to treat each other again like human beings and try to solve our problems through dialogue rather than through weapons. And Reverend Moon did a number of things over the years which helped to facilitate that. One of them was, beginning in 1975, he sent missionaries to all of the Eastern Bloc countries. Those people went through hell. Some of them died in prison. Some of them were executed. Some of them were exiled. But they went through those different types of ordeals. Secondly, through Unification Theological Seminary, where I studied and Dr. Walsh studied, he began not just interfaith dialogue, but he also began a Christian Marxist dialogue so that it was possible to be able to dialogue between these two sides. Thirdly, there was ICUS, the International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences, where not just Western scientists, but scientists from the Soviet bloc were also invited to come to dialogue and to establish relationships. And finally, and probably most importantly, was the World Media Conference that Reverend Moon began in 1982 to send journalists every year to the Soviet Union to be able to begin to establish ties there. And step by step, things began to open up and to develop until finally in 1990, Reverend Moon was invited to come to Moscow and to speak there. And a whole series of collaborations developed after that time. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But the same is true in the case of North Korea and the work of Reverend and Mrs. Moon. There was a carrot side and there was a stick side. The stick side was things like exposing the reality that Japanese women had been kidnapped. Sometimes very young women had been kidnapped and sent over to North Korea. Secondly, Japanese members, they went and they began to speak out against communism at Kim Il-sung University, which was located right in Tokyo. There were rallies at the United Nations against various types of movements and objectives that were being advanced by North Korea at various times during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And then there was just the reality of the victory over communism movement itself. Again, that moment of ripeness. After the Moscow rally, Reverend Moon asked Mr. Larry Moffat and Mr. Antonio Betancourt to begin to reach out to North Korea and say, now is the time when we have to begin to reconcile between the two of us. In 1991, there was an interview conducted by the Washington Times with Kim Il-sung, where Kim Il-sung was able to share his concerns and his thoughts about the situation of his country. And it was not done with a lot of critique. It just let the man speak. He was very impressed by that and very grateful that that opportunity was provided to him. And then there was the visit of Reverend and Mrs. Moon to North Korea itself, which was like the culminating point, which took place in November of 1991. I don't know if you've seen the video. It's well worth seeing the video because you can see that Kim Il-sung is kind of tense when he first meets Reverend Moon. He doesn't know quite what to do, but Reverend Moon just comes to him and just hugs him. And everything changes, everything melts. And at that moment, they begin to establish a friendship, you know. Reverend Moon had been in prison under Kim Il-sung. He'd been tortured under Kim Il-sung, but he forgave everything and just basically said to him, he called him elder brother, Hyung. He said, you're my elder brother. We have to work together to somehow save our peninsula. So that really moved Kim Il-sung. And also there was a number, back in June of 1992, I was privileged to be a part of this. There was a group of high-ranking former US officials, congressmen, senators, governors, members of the State Department, members of the CIA, all of these groups together, they traveled to North Korea and they spent an entire week in North Korea. They had a chance to meet with Kim Il-sung, with the government there, and Kim Il-sung was very honored by this. And actually, I received a phone call on the 23rd of June by the North Korean ambassador in New York. He asked me to organize a meeting. And I organized the meeting with the leader of our group. His name was Congressman Richard Eichord. And the Korean diplomat said that basically the Korean government was so pleased with the things that had happened that every year there had been what was called Anti-America Month. It goes from June 25th to July 27th. But he explained to us that that year, that was 1992, for the first time since the end of the Korean War, 1953, Anti-American Month was canceled. And it was canceled because he said he was so touched and impressed by what Reverend Moon had shown in terms of a different type of attitude and view towards North Korea as had ever been seen before. So let me just close by emphasizing one thing, however. We need a long-term vision whenever we're dealing with a conflict. Reverend Moon understood that so well in the case of the Soviet Union. He communicated over and over again to key people within the State Department, all the way up to President George H.W. Bush himself, and really emphasized, you need to embrace the Soviet Union. You need to love them. Now is the time to help them. This is really, really an important time. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Even though we asked for that, that did not happen. And what's the consequence? And by the way, I think one of the reasons why it didn't happen is because there was not a Universal Peace Federation back then. We didn't have the kind of entity, the kind of network that we have today. There was not that Universal Peace Federation. That didn't happen. So what happened? There is a man in power in Russia today who has been in power 3 years more than, Leonid Brezhnev. He basically has controlled that country now for 23 years. We lost an important chance. And now at this time, this is another important chance. Governments can be just expedient. NGOs international NGOs such as UPF, particularly UPF, is in a position to do more than just be expedient. We need a long-term solution because the question, I'll go back to what Madam Myla Tikal said. It's important that Korea have a free future. But Korea, both North Korea and South Korea, they both see as one of their principal enemies, Japan. They see Japan as a bigger enemy than China, basically. They see both sides. That's what kind of brings these two together. And it's very, very unfortunate because a unified Korea is wonderful, but a unified Korea under a communist China basically hegemony is not wonderful. It's really important that somehow, as Mother Moon says, we need a Shin unified Korea, a heavenly unified Korea. And to do that, I believe that the role of the Universal Peace Federation is the key in order to make that happen. And I'm so glad that Dr. Walsh, you've initiated these series of talks because they're crucial to making that happen. Thank you very much.
Another big wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Ward, for speaking to us so candidly. You're a person who really speaks from a position of knowledge, and you know, we're really so privileged to be able to hear what you had to say today. I really hope that this can be recorded and can be published even. You know, I think this is turning out to be an amazing, amazing webinar. Thank you again. Our next speaker is the Reverend Jenny Chalmers. Reverend Chalmers is an Anglican priest. She's the vicar of St Andrew's Church in Taupo and the Vicar General of the Diocese of Waiapu. She is the original convener of the Auckland Interfaith Council and the founding Christian co-chair of the Wellington Abrahamic Council. She continues as a member of that council. Jenny is married to John, and they have 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. Jenny is proud to have been an ambassador for peace for over 20 years. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Reverend Jenny Chalmers.
Well, tēnā koutou katoa, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you also to Madam Myung, to Dr. Thomas Walsh, Dr. Thomas Ward, fellow panelists. Goodness, what an eminent panel that you've assembled, and mine is a much more modest contribution than the contributions so far. But thank you for the privilege of inviting me to speak as a Christian on the unification of Korea. I've been asked to speak as a Christian, giving a Christian perspective, and so I'm going to present a modest proposal for reunification, and I stress it's a modest proposal. So any discussion of a Christian perspective has to begin with a text from the Bible. And so the text I'm using comes from the New Testament book, the Gospel of Matthew. And it's one that'll probably be well known to Christians who are watching this. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who went before you. And so I'm going to speak today as a Christian pacifist with a response to the division of the Korean nation, or more specifically to the reunification of the nation. In my view, the sunshine policy, or the reconciliation and cooperation policy toward the North, was an extremely helpful and traditional Korean way of overcoming animosity. Violence is a disaster, and that the overwhelming force by which we seek to assert ourselves when we assert our own self-righteousness. And this self-interest may well be our ruin. That Sermon of the Mount that I've just quoted from is a gift capable of transforming us into a gift for each other and therefore for the world. And if we hear these words as a modest proposal for peace and reconciliation, we don't have to begin with performance anxiety. We can simply say, we have to start somewhere, and we can start here. And the place to start with our modest proposal for reconciliation and peace is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And here's the thing, you don't have to start by trying to figure out what it means to be poor in spirit. You just have to get on with it. We begin by simply affirming that God welcomes the poor, the mourning, the meek, the hungry, and then extending in God's place a welcome. When we walk in solidarity with God's poor, God's response transforms our hearts so that we too are counted amongst the poor in spirit. Perhaps the message of the Beatitudes is that our relationship with God depends on how we welcome those whom God favors. That's the modest proposal, if ever there was one. So having said all of that, what is the thoughtful, honest strategy for confronting war, and particularly for the reunification of Korea? Over 10 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be invited to South Korea by the Universal Peace Federation. And I took the opportunity then to travel to the border, where, as we all know, you can stand in South Korea and look at North Korea, and you can feel very sad looking at those denuded hills. And of course, as we look at North Korea, we see in the soldiers who guard the place of armistice, people, if we look beyond their uniform. And they are people just like us, with modest hopes for a house to keep them warm, a partner to share their dreams with, and a future for their children that is better than the present. They're just like us. People just like us. Surely they too long for reunification. What then should the attitude be of a Jesus-following Christian in the West to those people in North Korea? How should we talk about North and South Korea amongst ourselves? And if we have a chance to speak to one of those people who were tasked with bringing about reunification, what might we encourage them to do? Well, as people of the book, and that's the name Muslims give to Christ followers, what's our posture? Jesus lived under an occupying force and dealt with zealots, men who would have been considered terrorists, and lest we forget, he was killed for that. So Jesus knew the pain, the suffering, the persecution, and terrorism firsthand. And he had a strategy for dealing with such enemies. And here's the first 5 points of his strategy. Take the log out of our own eyes before we help get the speck out of someone else's. And there are logs in the eyes of the West that we need to first recognize. For example, where do people at war get their weapons? Why and how is it that Korea is still inhabited by an army of occupation after all of this time? And I mean since the Korean War. The second one, blessed are the eyes that see and the ears that hear. We need to see, to hear, and to understand, to actually listen. There are reasons why the peninsula is divided. We may not like them, we may not want to understand them, but a mature and wise policy will seek to know. And we need to keep asking the question, why? Why is there a particular stance? If you were in their shoes, would you be tempted to do something similar or something different? If you grew up in a country where you had no education, no power, no ability to travel, no economic opportunity, and someone handed you a gun and said, we can take that what should be ours anyway, would you be tempted? It might be easy to say no, but are you sure? Saul was a terrorist before he became St. Paul. There's always hope. There's always room for talk. And turn the other cheek. Carry the pack an extra mile and give them the coat off your back. Heaping coals on the head of North Korean peoples is an effective short-term strategy for shaming the enemy and a shame on a culture like Korea. Jesus was rooted in Middle Eastern culture, which is also a shame on a culture. Jesus understood the power of shame and employs it brilliantly in these 3 simple strategies and these words. Each strategy Jesus spoke of is to show that the one who is being abused can take power back from the abuser by taking charge of the situation. Turning the cheek isn't about being passive, but a way to force the man who struck first to think about what he's doing before striking again. It's also an example of humility, the humility that we must practice, both because we are Christians and because peace can only be achieved by acts of humility. Think again for a minute about that sunshine policy of South Korea. There was a chance for peace then, if ever there was one. What if we spent the money that we put into putting troops on the ground into working out creative ways of practicing humility? What might we come up with? Feeding the poor, educating the poor, and then what might happen? Finally, the injunction to love your enemy, bless them, and loan without expecting return suggests that we might develop a long-term strategy for confronting evil. These are the injunctions of Christ: to love, to bless, to give to our enemies, and their long-term strategies which almost certainly won't work right now within the current situation. But we have to be thinking about the next generation and the future. Who are the kids in North Korea playing ball with a life truncated by poverty, not enough to eat, substandard education, who could have become successful academics, businessmen and women, given the chances that we've all had? To love, bless, and give to your enemy speaks of development and opportunity. Are we taking economic and educational reform seriously enough in North Korea? And if not, why not? Of course, there are legitimate arguments to be made, and we've heard them today, that when people submit themselves fully to evil, war is our last option. Well, I'm a pacifist, but the situation of the women in Afghanistan, the Yazdiks, the girls kidnapped in Nigeria, and of course the many, many others killed and absconded for no particular reason, brings me to another way. Christians and those committed to the ways of Jesus have argued that position of a just war since the days of St. Augustine, and this is attractive to our need for justice. However, I think we're a bit quick to employ that strategy. Jesus gave us some clear methods for confronting our enemies. Jesus' way was not passive. The way of the cross is perhaps the most subversive stance toward evil ever taken. The love that God offers the world in Christ is not wimpy. It's a robust affront to the systems of our day that cry out for blood and revenge. The way of Jesus is a hard way. Forgiveness, love, choosing to lay down our lives on the most difficult path in the face of real enemies, and evil is real, but love is more powerful. Paul summarized this way of Jesus well when he said, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good."
Thank you so much, Reverend Jenny. A lovely Christian presentation of approach to these conflict situations, and especially thank you for beautiful reading of the Sermon on the Mount, and also hearing about the difficulties that Jesus went through, including terrorism, which is a very interesting perspective, and also the strategies that he employed to deal with that. So we're very much appreciative of your presentation today. Thank you so much. Our final panel presenter now is, last but certainly not least, Dr. Thomas G. Walsh. He is the chairman of UPF International, so we're really privileged to have him speak to us today. He is also co-chair of the Board of Trustees of the University of Bridgeport in the United States, member of the Board of Directors of the Washington Times. He's chair of the Sung Hak Peace Prize Foundation, executive director of Dialogue and Alliance, the UPF publication, and also co-chair of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. He has a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University in the United States. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Thomas G. Walsh.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Reverend Greg Stone, for putting together what is a remarkable panel of insightful presenters. Thank you, Mr. Yamada, for your opening address and for your work on behalf of UPF in Oceania. And really, I've benefited greatly from listening to each of these presenters. And as each one spoke, I was persuaded by each one. So of the insight that I received. And I have had the good fortune to have been together with Madam Adekoyulamara Ailetikau on several occasions, and she never fails to deliver with great dignity and wisdom, and drawing both from her legal and political experiences, as well as, which is often the case among the Pacific Islanders, a kind of a keen spiritual sense that doesn't have this radical divorce between the sacred and the secular. So I truly feel educated in the best sense by your remarks concerning our topic today. And also, I had not heard from Ambassador Buzo before, but obviously very knowledgeable both of the North and the South Korean situation. He talked about we have to think in terms of baby steps, and you know, I think Dr. Ward referred to having a long game plan, and so did Reverend Chalmers. But I think he sees how this conflict has gone on for decades. You know, we're I don't want to say celebrating, but we're recognizing 70, going into the 71st year since the start of the Korean War. And as was mentioned, an armistice was signed, and Reverend Chalmers was there at the DMZ where the border from the armistice exists, and but no peace treaty has been established. So it continues, and we watch politically. I thought, you know, weaving some of the thought from Dr. Ward and just hearing from Ambassador Buzo, there's a certain asymmetry of sorts between what we might call the liberal democratic societies and if you will, the authoritarian democratic systems that have leaders such as President Vladimir Putin for 23 years, and President Xi, who is on his way, maybe he will compete with President Putin, and the dynasty of the Kim family in North Korea, up against the continually changing circumstances of, first of all, South Korea and its political dynamics, often with great disruptions. Change of prime ministers in Japan sometimes happens frequently. The United States shifting, sometimes lurching in one direction and then in another. There's a kind of political asymmetry there that further complicates the realities of finding a solution. Why not just wait until the next leader comes to power? You know, we have the lame duck problem continually there. But I've known Dr. Ward for several decades, going back to the 70s, and did not get to work closely with him during that time, but from a distance, marveled at the work that he and his team were doing that took him around the world, and working closely with, at that time, Father Moon was very prominent. He had been in a North Korean prison camp for years and had been brutally persecuted. Mother Moon, as spoken in her memoir, was a refugee from North Korea. They were from strong Christian backgrounds. And as the regime in Pyongyang began to take hold, it was dangerous to be a Christian, so many did flee to the south so they could continue their ministries. And that is a very moving story in and of itself. You know, I don't want to take a lot of time. There's a lot more I'd like to say. You know, as Reverend Chalmers was speaking, I kept nodding my head, and also I'm thinking about I was a fan of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of my kind of intellectual mentors. And he was, of course, the advocate of Christian realism, and you know, had a very different take than Reverend Chalmers, and quite powerful and influential in his time. But I think we can never ignore the very, very strong aspect of the Christian worldview, and Jesus, indeed, the New Testament worldview that Reverend Chalmers articulated. And I think Father and Mother Moon embraced that. And if I dare say, I think Mother Moon perhaps even more so than Father Moon. I think she fundamentally has this love for the North Korean people and is not too reticent at times of being somewhat critical of Western nationalist policies, and even of the way in which Christian history has played out, from colonialism in Africa to some of the developments of civilizations that aren't only virtuous, but the greedier aspects that have emerged. Even as we look at democracies, there's a lot of corruption, and the connection with corporate interests over political parties and even over the media, at least in my country, in the United States, is quite disturbing. And so I think UPF is deeply committed to this principle of dialogue. And it does include the listening, Reverend Chalmers, as you said very well, that we must listen to one another, have the empathy and the mutual respect that is needed. And Reverend Moon, you know, I'd hazard to say how much financial investment he put into North Korea for the sake of the people, to the sacrifice of his own movement, his own family, over and over and over again. So I think he did embody that ideal. He could speak strongly, but was overwhelmed by his own heart and his own love. And I think UPF tries to embody that spirit. Just to conclude, we are throughout this year going to have a series of programs. This webinar is one of them. I think this is a high point in the work that we're doing, but these seminars will have by the end of the year probably 300 or 400 similar webinars in every corner of the world. We will have a major launch or inauguration of a group of experts, creating a global network expert working group with experts and parties that are deeply interested in and want to engage with the effort for peaceful reunification of Korea from all sectors: government, religion, civil society, media, and academia, working together collaboratively. In November, Dr. Ward mentioned, and I think Reverend Yamada also, the 30th anniversary of Father and Mother Moon's visit to North Korea, their hometowns. We will have a major global summit similar to the World Summit we had in February of 2020. And this will be on as grand a scale, if not more, but with a very, very sharp and important focus on the conversation that we're having here together today. And I think what has been said here will be extremely relevant to our discussions in Korea. And hopefully, perhaps we will have delegations going to Pyongyang at that time. I mean, I'm not saying that's scheduled, but I can't imagine otherwise. Then that would also be of great interest to Mother Moon and to UPF. So let's stay in good communication. I hope I didn't exceed my time too much. I just want to conclude by once again expressing great appreciation for the panelists who've gathered here. It makes me very proud of UPF and of your work here in Oceania. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. Yeah, amazing. I'm always so amazed. He just spoke extemporaneously. He just picked up all the key points and did a a broad sort of overview of the speeches, and then gave us a great deal of hope, I think, about the way forward. And I think one thing that has come out to me here is that the world doesn't have a lot of hope for the reunification of North Korea. But I think where is the hope? Where is the drive? Where are the ideas coming from? And where is the initiative coming from? To me, it's coming from UPF and the whole broad range of supporters and people who are working with UPF. That's where it's coming from. So, it gives me a great deal of hope. Anyway, now to draw to the next and final stage is the question and answer. And I'd like to ask Mr. John Adamides. He is the president of UPF in Australia, and he is here to conduct the Q&A session and to select some of the questions that we've received so far. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all our participants. It's really a privilege to be here together with you. I was happy to be in the US and had the opportunity to go through the CAUSA and the VOC information, and I was part of a team that went around Florida doing that within the churches. And the most powerful thing that I found in the presentations was the people receiving it were completely overwhelmed by the truth. I felt that when the truth was clearly explained, then it was just received. As Dr. Walsh mentioned before about the book that the French wrote that explained what was happening and 100 million people dying because of communism, it was just completely received because it was truth, it was irrefutable, and it just meant we've got to do something because of it. You can't just let the truth lie and do nothing. It needs the response. So we have some questions that have been presented, and still more just appearing now. And there are some questions that are general to all the panelists, and some that are specifically to one or two people. So I'd like to start off, because we won't do, Greg, how many questions or time is allowed for this?
I think one or two, John. I think
okay.
We're coming towards the end.
Sure. So one question that I'd like to ask that's directed mostly to Dr. Ward or maybe shared together with Reverend Chalmers is a question relating to the biblical perspective. Can someone speak about that perspective in regards to the 700-year Babylonian captivity that was experienced at that time, how that is in relation, or do they see some relation of that in the Korea situation? And Reverend Moon spoke about the 70-year captivity of Babylonia in Babylonian as a time period in which change occurred. So I'll just bring up all of our participants so everyone can see, and ask Dr. Ward to please address that question. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer that question. Maybe there's somebody else who can do a better job than me.
Reverend Chalmers.
Well, I have to say that I'm feeling exactly the same, but I would say it was that period of captivity that from which we get all of our psalms and in which the first canon was put together. So there's hope if we're to draw that simile, that this will be a huge period of creativity for the North Koreans. Apart from that, I'm not so well versed with how Father Moon was thinking about it. So I'll dip out now and let somebody who knows far more than I do get on.
Yeah, okay.
There are a lot of people around who know more than me.
Sure. Is there anyone else who wants to address that? No, okay. That's all right. There's plenty of questions here. So in relation, open to all the panelists, we have questions asking, is there real hope for reunification? Is it possible with the expected lukewarm or even tacit support of the current US administration? Who would like to address that? Do we really have real hope? And can we expect? Yes.
I'm happy to at least make some comments on that. Within diplomacy, change occurs because of things that maybe none of us anticipate. It can be a natural tragedy. It can be a change of government. It can be the passing of a political figure. It can be a political figure who has a eureka moment and suddenly changes his or her direction in terms of where things are going. So I think we have to all have hope about that. I'm hopeful that there can be changes that can occur that can transform this situation. If you have just a flat perspective, maybe it looks like nothing will change, but actually it just takes a moment for things to open up. I mean, I think that was the great thing about Reverend Moon. After he went to Moscow, he said, now's the time to go to North Korea. And he went, he sensed that. And I think that in like what was said by Reverend Stone, I agree, UPF is meant to play a central role. And it's very powerful that right now we are led by a woman in terms of UPF, by the role that's played by Mother Moon. I think that's a very, very important position, if you will, the fact that she's there and that she has the ability, basically, I think, to sense, okay, this is the right time to do this or the right time to do that. And she's been able to keep, as we all know, an ongoing relationship with North Korea. She's been able to preserve that. So I'm confident that a moment of ripeness will occur. That's how it's referred to diplomatically. A moment of ripeness will come where we can act and we can be able to go forward and see some dramatic things. I think that what Dr. Walsh is doing through these international seminars on UPF, actually it's creating that kind of atmosphere because people are talking about it. How many people are talking about the unification of the Koreas besides us? Nobody. They're all talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about, forget about those things. Let's talk about bringing these two together. So I think that's extremely, extremely hopeful. It's a very interesting angle that UPF has chosen in terms of all this.
Okay, thank you. And just the final question, this relates to how religion and politics work together. So what do you see is the new perspective or that will enable religion and politics to work together, and who will take the lead in these sort of negotiations? Who would like to make a response to that? Dr. Walsh, yeah? Go ahead.
I can say a little bit about that. I think in much of the world, religion and politics do work together, even where it's perhaps denied. But if you kind of do, you know, a look at the world more broadly, you see, you know, perhaps 50 plus nations that are majority Muslim, and they very much have some sense of how to try to integrate the political and the religious, that they don't see this so-called separation of church and state or sacred and secular spheres in the same way that Christianity, modern Christianity, particularly post-Reformation Christianity has. Buddhism is very much integrated in places like Thailand or Sri Lanka. It's very, very closely held. Hinduism in India. So many people talk about the post-secular era, and the exception of the perhaps stronger separation of religion and the political sphere. I'm not talking about theocracies. I'm talking about where religion is a social force that has impact. It goes into people's will formation and political will formation. It informs ideas and thinking, whether you're a pacifist or a Christian realist, so to speak. Those ideas impact your political life. And that's changing also in the so-called predominantly secular world. I mean, America has always been very much a separation of church and state, but a political system that is highly charged with religion, even pluralistic, albeit, but where religion is very much a social force. So I think we have extremes where certain kind of authoritarian theocratic systems I have no interest in personally, but finding a balanced integration, I think we're moving in that direction, because the secular paradigm ultimately leaves people empty, without substance and meaning in their lives, if relying on that alone. And even if you evacuate the political sphere of that kind of necessary substance and meaning that is what animates people and why they do good things and even obey the law, it's often a spiritual, moral vision.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. And that concludes our question and answer, and I'll pass it back to Greg. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much. Now it's my time to just draw the webinar to a conclusion. In closing, I just want to sincerely congratulate and thank all of our speakers. You've really made this a remarkable webinar. I think I'm the MC, and maybe I'm not supposed to enjoy it, but I thoroughly enjoy it and thoroughly stimulated by all the presentations personally. So thank you all. And we've all been enriched in our hearts and minds, and you've provided us with insight and a new thought about approaching this issue of the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you also to our viewers for their interest and for their support. Thank you to our technical team who made this all possible. And we invite you to look out for future UPF webinars, which will further develop on the theme of the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula, as well as other stimulating content related to meeting the challenges and concerns of our world this time. So thank you again. Have a very enjoyable remaining weekend. God bless you all. Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much.